It's kind of cool. We are starting a new collection called First Person. Now, this is a teaching I've done before, and it's really cool. I remember the first time I heard this teaching and learned from it, it really changed my perspective on Scripture, on what the Bible is even meant for, and how we use it, and how we see it through the lens of the disciples and whoever made it, the canon, whoever decided what is going to be in this binding in this book. It's what validates the Bible. And you might not know that, right? Because growing up, you were just told, believe the Bible. Believe it. That's where we get our source from. But truthfully, we don't believe Jesus because the Bible tells us so. We believe in Jesus because who influenced the Bible, and then we get to have the Bible now and hear their influence. Does that make sense? It probably doesn't, and that's okay. And that's what this whole collection is going to be about. So the cool thing is, we're calling it First Person, and we're going to be following John as he watches Jesus. John had a first-person account, and that is very important because any event in life, if you are wanting to understand, it's why we love documentaries and behind the scenes, right? Backstage passes. We love that kind of stuff because we get to see, how does it happen? And the people that are involved, right? We want to know the first person account. So we want to know for someone who saw it, who was there, who got to be there, right? And it's not only just the details. It's also the emotion, the logic, the understanding, and why they do what they did to understand an event. And so that's why we love first-person accounts. So again, it's the idea of a first-person account. I'm going to dig into that just a little bit. It always hasn't been a thing. It's normal to us, and it's not as we know it, what first-person account has historically been. It wasn't until the 17th and 18th century that we know first-person accounts like we do today, and it was because it was introduced in art. So diaries, memoirs, documentaries, all self-published biography, all these things are from a first-person account narrative. The books that you enjoy, right? It's either from a single character's point of view or a narrator or something, and it's a way that we can immerse people in a story. So it's going to sound crazy. This wasn't really a mainstream thing until, like I said, the 17th or 18th century. And then it goes on and it's used in books and all sorts of entertainment and art. And then it's introduced in the 70s, and we've become to know it better from news anchors. In the 70s, when they were able to finally pipe in footage live from somewhere else using satellites and all this. Then we had the anchor on the scene, right? You had somebody that was in the studio, and they was like, we're cutting to blah, blah, blah on the scene, right? And they're on the scene, and there was somebody that just saw what happened. And they'll say, hey, we got blah, blah here. We got Joe, and this is the first-person account of the building that burnt down or whatever. And they describe it, and it's flames, right? And through time and through social media, we end up with some really funny ones, right? Ain't nobody got time for that, that kind of stuff, if you get the reference. So it was introduced, and it was a way to spread information in a more dynamic way. Because before that, it was just like, here it is. Like Walter Cronkite and, and all that. They would state it. It was like, here's the information. This is what happened in Wyoming or whatever. And that was it. That's all you got. But now they introduced the first person, so it became more known to us. So this type of communication was not very common historically. It's common to us, became more prominent about 3 centuries ago. But however, John's gospel is presented in this way. And so his ability to do this was before its time. I'm sure at some point in history it's been done, but to have it done in something so official and so affecting right? It's not just for entertainment purposes. I just want them to feel the story. No, he's like, there's something, a big event has changed the world, and I need them to understand it. So that's why, in this style, why we have something called, have you ever heard of the Synoptic Gospels? The Synoptic Gospel is 3 of the Gospels. It's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we call them the Synoptic Gospels because they synchronize. They validate each other, right? And so it's one, Matthew said it happened this way, Mark said it happened this way, and Luke said it happened this way. And they line up. And they're very similar in their order, in the sequence, and how they're presented. John's is not really that way. John's has some extra stuff in it. It's different. It's not as, although it does confirm the others, and the others validate also John, they're not succinct. There's a purpose in why John did it the way he did. His is more immersive and more dynamic in nature. I mean, there's a purpose to it. It's not just for fun. It's not just for entertainment's sake. It's very purpose. He poured himself into the text. He wanted readers then. He's probably only thinking about people then, right? Because when Jesus said he was coming back, he didn't give a time, so they didn't know when. They thought it was going to be within their lifetime, right? And that's why it was so rush, get it across the world, and that's what Jesus wanted. But so for them, any reader in that time and after, he wanted them to have a dynamic view of the life of Jesus and what he did, and why John actually began to believe. So because, like I said, Jesus, he came to do something revolutionary beyond human understanding. And John and everybody else that got to watch had a first-person account of that. So it matters. So before we jump into Scripture, I want to address a misnomer. If you don't know what misnomer is, it means it's a word that you use in the wrong way, right? It's misnomer. It's a misunderstanding of the meaning of a word. We do this, and it's John's account of Jesus is crucial to this, for us understanding this. There's 2 distorted words in Christianity, and the weird thing, it only happens in Christianity. Sure, I'm in some other faith religions, it might be that way, but in Christianity, we take these 2 words, and we've muddled them, and we've messed them up, and now they kind of mean something different, and we use them in different ways. It is faith and belief. We have misused these words. Aside from spiritual matters, okay? And just for a moment, I know we're in church. God aside, right? Just these words, right? Whether you believe or not. Spiritual matters aside. Belief, as we know, is the evidence of something. Belief is based in evidence. The closer the account, the better, right? And then based on the ramification of the subject, like setting, timing, in people, whoever is saying it, it's more ideal if all 3 of those are succinct, right? If any CSI show, any crime show that you watch, they want to know time, setting, and people. When did it happen? Where did it happen? And who were the people involved, right? And the more solid information that they have, the better the case they have. Case closed, right? It is fixed. If they're missing information, they end up with a cold case that they have to solve later in hopes that the information will arise. So it validates and it strengthens based on those things. And so here's an example of that. So if you're in science class and you have a science teacher, right? This is the designated time for that, right? And in science class, this science teacher is standing amongst a bunch of measurement devices all around. There's beakers, there's fluid, there's all sorts of measurements all around them because science uses all that stuff. And your science teacher says to you, hey, did you know that 1 tablespoon of any liquid is actually 0.5 ounces? What would you do? Okay. And you'd write it down in your notes. You're not going home and getting a tablespoon and 0.5 ounces and measuring to make sure that they were right, correct? Your math teacher, the same thing. If the math teacher tells you 4 times 5 is 20. And you go, okay, you're not going home and counting out 20 things and dividing it up and making sure that they're telling you the truth. So location, setting, timing, and whoever it is will create an opportunity to believe in something. Sometimes we get conflicting information and we don't know what to believe. The current hot topic in our day and age is tariffs. You never knew that you would know there was so much information about tariffs until it was talked about, right? I've gone on my whole life. I've heard about tariffs. I've heard about the Boston Tea Party. I've heard about all of that kind of stuff. But it didn't affect me because I don't know. I don't have any control over that. But all of a sudden, the rest of America thinks that we do, and it's really out of our hands. We get told what the tariffs are going to be. But all of a sudden, I know a lot more information about Canada's tariffs, about Mexico's tariffs, about the UK's tariffs, right? And so I don't know what's right or wrong. I can see people argue the best side of it, of like why we should do this and why we should get rid of income tax and all that stuff, which I would not be mad about. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but I wouldn't be mad about it. That's for sure. And so I don't know if it's good or I don't know if tariffs are bad and we shouldn't do that. And usually the person that you find on which side of that argument, chances are it's positive in their life. Whatever circumstances they have in their life, it works for them better to have it in this direction. So, we call that confirmation bias. We struggle with this. And sometimes it's hard to see the light of something if the circumstances of it benefit us. And it's easier to look the other way on the non-benefits of it, right? The things that could potentially hurt others. But we accept the info that supports our interests. Religious faith and belief are often divorced from reason, and they get confused because of hope. We'll use hope, and it gets confused. Hope is good to have, but hope doesn't come before belief. If hope comes before belief, that means you're doomed already. If you're saying, well, I'm going to believe because I don't have any other option, so I'm going to have hope in this, right? That means you're doomed. You don't have any other opportunity, so you might as well hope. Hope that it's going to happen, because otherwise it's not going to work, because you don't have any way of affecting it, right? So you're doomed regardless. So that's when hope is for belief. But if you have breath in your lungs, you are not doomed. You are not doomed. There's always opportunity. And you can't. We like to use hope this way. You know those commercials, I forget what it's called, flex tape, I think, right? And it's like he's showing like a big tube of water and it's got a leak on it, and he takes the tape and he slaps it on there, right? And it stops the water. We treat hope the same way. Okay, so if we're trying to understand God and trying to understand theology and where Jesus came from and how it matters to me and all that, and then there's like a crack, there's like a broke seam in our theology, we'll say, well, you just hope. You throw hope on there, and it'll fix it, right? And that might work for a moment, depending on the size of the leak, right? But if there's a hole in that part of your theology, then chances are another hole is going to resurface somewhere else. And you could have all the flex tape in the world, the hope flex tape, but you'll run out at some point. And a lot of people, I think that is their journey, that they were told to believe, right? They were told, if you're from the South, it was, well, you just got to believe, brother. You know, just got to have more faith, sister. When people were struggling with their theology. And that's kind of that's like, have more hope. You just got to have hope in what you believe, in what you have faith in. And that is very true. But that's not how it worked out. And really, says who? Because in Scripture, I don't really find that. That's something that we have developed to make us more comfortable as an easy fix, because it's a lot more messy and intimidating because we don't have all the facts and information on it, that we just say, hey, you just gotta believe harder. Well, can you believe harder with the lack of evidence? Because more evidence makes you believe more. right? And then because of the evidence, you have hope in something. And then that's where the faith comes in. So it's belief, hope, and then faith. And if you were told, you probably were, you were told just to believe, and perhaps you did what you told and you believed, right? If you grew up in church and somebody said, well, you just have to, like your parents like, okay, you're my parents, I guess, we got to do this thing, right? And I did too. They said, hey, there's this person and this blah, blah, blah. That's the same thing with our kids. Just believe, right? And they do. And you're probably a good little boy or girl and you believed, but then you grew up and you experienced some things. You heard a lecture. You read a book. You watched a certain movie. You saw a very convincing post on Facebook. And it created a hole. Thank you for that. It created a hole in your theology. There was a leak somewhere. And hope wasn't enough to seal or fix it. The statement, you just got to believe harder. Just got to have more faith, didn't solve that dilemma. And you probably walked away. John would say that way of believing, by just have more faith, he would say, honestly, he would probably say that's crazy. He said, why would you do that? It's not necessary. John didn't choose to follow Jesus because of faith. He would not ask you to do the same either. As we're about to discover, there's a big difference in just by faith and because of faith. There's a huge difference by faith and because of faith. He didn't leave his life behind, his business, his family, his friends, because of faith. He didn't do that. And I know we read scripture and it talks about faith a lot, and it's kind of understand the context and all those things as far as the event and when it happened, but that's not how it went down. He believed because of what he saw. And he outlived his friends on earth. And so he was probably the last remaining apostle. And so he was encouraged to document his story. Because they were dying off, right? And that's how they knew in the time. They would just tell stories. They would just pass it along. They would, remember, first person, right, accounts, like how we know them today, all the emotion, all that wasn't a thing. They would just deliver information. And they were like, John, can you please, probably begging him, write this down for us so that when you pass, we can accurately tell this very important, life-changing, world-changing story and believe in the same way that you did. So he outlived his friends, and so he was encouraged to document it, and so then we have the Gospel of John. And he wasn't content to tell us just what happened. He tells us why it happened. And at the end of his account, he says this, and he gives us purpose to his statement. Again, this is at the end, closer to the end. It says, John 20, 30 through 31, it says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. He's saying there's not only just miracles that happened, there's signs. And he chose this specifically to say, why did he do that? And we continue on in verse 31. It says, but these are written that you may believe. This is kind of, it looks into what they call the henna clause, right? It's like something is attached to something. This is the connecting bridge, right? We want you to believe in Jesus, and here's the connecting bridge why, right? These are the signs. This is the evidence. These are the things that happened that should give you reason to believe. And so he's saying, I'm not telling you to believe just because I said so. I'm telling you to believe because of what I saw and the events that happened. And these weren't just miracles, they were signs. He's not just telling the audience what to believe. He's not convinced. John was not convinced in the just believe it, brother. He was not into that. He was building a case as to why they should believe, whoever's reading it. And they say, believe what? He's very specific. Continue on in verse 31. That you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And beyond that, right? Beyond this result. And that by believing, you may have life in his name. So not only will you believe that he is who he said he was, But because you believe, you will have life in his name. There's not just, these are the events that are happening and it's real, but this is for you. And this can affect you and your life. So John lays it out and why he became a follower or believer of Jesus. And there were events that served as signs or signals, events, signs, evidence, to believe that, to trust in. It was good enough for him, and he figured it would be good enough for his readers. And he organized his first-person account, showcasing these 7. So we're going to break down over these next week, starting today, 7 events, 7 signs, 7 things that happened, giving us a more dynamic view of Jesus. And if the disciples were reporters, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are like in the studio, right? And they're behind, right? And they're just delivering information. And John's the reporter in the field, right? That's how he performed his account. He says, I'm not only going to tell you what happened, I'm going to tell you what happened before and how we led to there, the context of it all. We're going to be on the scene together so you can see Jesus through John's eyes. That was his effort. And he's like, because there's things that happen that you got to know about. All right, so 7 signs. We will look at all 7, but first, it's interesting that John uses, again, the word sign rather than miracle. Jesus didn't just perform random acts of kindness. I'm sure at some point they were probably viewed that way, because if you don't understand the context of someone's kindness, it looks like a random act. And not saying there's not random acts of kindness, they're out there, but Jesus didn't do that. His actions were a confirmation of what was and what was to come. They pointed to something, and that was Jesus' identity and who he was and as he revealed himself. And it's easy to get enamored with signs, and John knew that would be a mistake. So rather than be awestruck by the events, he wants you to be awestruck by the one that caused the events. Because if you get locked into the events, that's a fixed point, and that's not a relationship. He wants you to be awestruck by the one that caused the events, to be in relationship with the one that is always living, who lived on, who is with us today. That Scripture tells us. Okay, so stating that out, that's what we're going to do in the next couple weeks. So let's jump in. The first one, the first sign, water to wine. This is usually people's favorite one, right? Especially wine drinkers. Like, man, why can't Jesus give us that power, right? I would start a vineyard, and I would be busting with money. So the first sign, water to wine, and it rhymes, which is really great. Chances are everybody probably knows this one. You probably have heard this one. John felt the same way. And so he didn't actually identify it as a miracle, because this was kind of common knowledge at this point. And again, the timing, he was like, Jesus come back soon. I don't need to go too detailed, right? So he's just giving the information to a certain crowd, not knowing that 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years after, we're going to be looking at this, right? So he didn't specify it because it was like a known thing at the time. So he assumed everybody knew. So he kind of just jumps right in. And so John 2, 1 through 7, it says, on the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee, and Jesus' mother was there. Apparently, Mary at some point, I guess, got a catering business or something, or she was like a wedding host, I don't know, whatever you call it. So this is happening, right? So continue on. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. So Jesus and his crew was there, right? They rolled in. I'm sure they had an entrance and all that. Everybody's, oh, it's them, that kind of thing. So John was also there, so we know that because him and his disciples were there. John was there. He was an eyewitness. And the wedding celebrations in this time, which it still kind of happens around the world, it was days. Days. Not 4 hours, not 3 hours, it was days of celebrating these weddings, because it was more than, I'm not trying to demean weddings nowadays, but in this time, it was about joining families for power and strength. right? With resources. You got sheep, I got ox, and if we marry our kids together, then we can share in the bounty of both and become more powerful and more rich and protection and all this stuff. So it was literally a celebration for the whole family, the union of the two. So it made sense why they kind of went on for days and days and days. So because they go on days and days and days, and in weddings now that are just a few hours, you can run out of wine. So you can imagine they ran out of wine, right? Okay, so we'll continue on. Verse 3, it says, when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. She knew in a crisis, she could turn to Jesus. Some people don't catch that. That she immediately turned to Jesus. She didn't go, hey, get the wine dealer on the phone, right? Or head down to whatever vineyard. They didn't do that. She immediately turned to Jesus, her resourceful son, because she knew that he could do something about it. And because I would imagine she saw him do some pretty unbelievable things before. And can you imagine like being the parent of Jesus, what it was like growing up? Hey, we're out of eggs. Jesus, I'm going to turn around. And if all of a sudden there's eggs in the carton, right, I'm not going to say anything. You know what I mean? Like the butter, how do we get more butter? So I would imagine there are some things that probably happened that led her to the idea that Jesus can do some stuff that other humans can't. And so he responds back to her. She says, there's no more wine. And then he says, woman. Guys, do not try this at home. You are not Jesus, okay? You cannot. I wouldn't advise it, okay? I wouldn't advise it, right? You better have a big smile on your face. You better be laughing before you finish the word woman so that woman knows that you're not trying to be disrespectful. But he didn't mean it as a disrespectful thing. It was more of a, my lady, right? He's like, come on, like, mom, right? But he couldn't say mom because they're in a more formal atmosphere, and that would be embarrassing for Jesus, I would imagine. So he says, my lady, continue on. So verse 4, woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my hour has not yet come. What a weird statement. What a weird statement. It's like he's saying, Mom, I've come to save the world, not weddings. This wasn't how I was planning to go public. It's not very messianic, right? To be the wine guy. But Mom asked, and you do what Mom asks, right? Mom asks, you do what Mom asks. It's just how the thing goes. And so Mary, I'm sure, smiles. Jesus, we're out, right? And he says the statement, and she goes, uh-huh. And she turns away, right? And she turns, and then she says this. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Do whatever he tells you. Because she knows it's not going to come in a way that you expect. So do whatever he says. She walks away. John, I'm sure, in his recount, rehearsing this in his memory, it dawned on him. This was the perfect introduction, and not necessarily to the wedding guests, but for his future readers and for the disciples who were about to go on a very rough journey with him. And they needed something. They needed something, some evidence of something, some assurance, something to see, to verify. Even though they had saw some, they're already following, right? They've already seen some things, but he knew this was the moment that they're going to talk about for forever. From this point forward, that's going to be the beginning of something special, something that's going to be revolutionary. So he told this for you and I. So verse 6. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. So these things were massive, right? You can imagine a Home Depot 5-gallon bucket is about that big. And so 20 to 30, that's like a size of me, right? So I don't know if people just were bigger back then or what, like they just bear hug those things, but I would need a dolly or 6 people, right? And so he'd have these 4 things, and they were used, and it's very specific in reference, they were used for ceremonial washing, right? So good Jewish followers had a lot of ceremonial actions that they did, just like we have today, that respected their Creator. And they did that to show physical representation of what they honored on the inside. Right? It's like why we baptize. And it's a outward representation. So their ceremonial washing and all the things they did, they would clean their fingers in a certain way and their elbows, and depending on whatever the event, the ceremony that is happening, it would change things, right? But it was all supposed to be in respect of their Creator. And these were icons. These were physical representations of the covenant and traditions Jesus had come to replace. These were physical representations of the covenant tradition that Jesus came to replace. It was literally and metaphorically empty. The jars were. And so this is his moment that he decides he's going to go public using something that would soon be replaced. It's very meaningful in his actions. God's temporary arrangement with Israel was disappearing. It was going to go away. And someone new had to come to replace it. And so he foreshadows, right? He's foreshadowing our most impactful, any kind of foreshadowing, it's most impactful when you already have seen it, right? So if you watched a movie, seen it through, maybe it's one of your favorite movies, I don't know, you watched it as a kid, loved it, and then you watch it again later, and you realize there was some foreshadowing that happened, right? So you watch this like, oh, I had no idea. That had to do with the ending. They basically led us to what the truth was before it happened. So I would imagine this is kind of what happened to John. As he's reviewing this story in his head, reviewing his life, putting pen to paper, he goes, wait a minute. That wasn't just a cool party trick. He was actually foreshadowing. He was actually trying to tell us something. He was saying this is what's going to happen in a way that they could understand, but they were probably so enamored by the miracle of what happened, they missed it in the moment. And so, as I would imagine, as John, he's getting goosebumps as he recalls now knowing what he knows. So, verse 7, Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. It's a lot of water. And these jars, again, represented the old vessels of God's connection, now empty. Again, catch that. They were empty, meaning it's gone. And then he filled them back up, meaning he is fulfilling something that already existed. Okay, just stay with me. So he fills the jars. The jars are filled with the promises that they already knew, which was empty now. And God is doing something new while still fulfilling the old purpose. So it's not that he broke them and destroyed them. He's basically saying, what I'm going to do, I'm filling them back up as not to abandon what was before, but to replenish. And then he takes it a step further, right? He's up to something new. It's a perfect introduction to his public ministry, a foreshadowing. So in John 2:8-10, it says, then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. This is like the head waiter. This is the person that's in charge of when the food comes out, when drinks come out, and the timing of it all to make sure everybody's having fun and enjoying. It's like a wedding coordinator. I guess that would be the equivalent. And who is served in what time, right? And so very important person. So he said, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. So they did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water. Now, if you didn't know the ending of the story, you would go, wait a minute, they wanted wine. Oh no, he's going to taste it and be mad because it's water, right? That's not what they want. They want wine. It's time to celebrate. And John assumes, he didn't caveat it, John assumes that his readers already know how it turned out. That the water that had, it says, the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. So he did something, which would some call a miracle, magical, whatever it may be. And in the moment, I could see how you could look at that and go, wow, that was really cool, and move on. But it's so much bigger than that. It's so much more than that. So continue on. It says, number 9, he did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, this is where it gets really cool. He pulls the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. This is still a trick that is used today, right? Because you're not going to be able to taste it after, right? You're not going to be able to tell the difference if it's good or bad. And so, bring the good stuff out first, and then we'll just lay waste with them with all the not so good wine, because they're not going to care anyways, right? They're just going to keep celebrating. The people, they were already drunk. They wouldn't have noticed. The guests have had too much to drink, but you have saved the best till now. And so did God. The covenant and the preparation and everything that he did with the Israelites and his people, all great. And so it's not that was a terrible thing. What he's saying is that was good, but what's coming is even better. What Jesus is going to do, you can't understand as a human. We do not understand how water can be turned into wine. But the creator of the universe, who can see every molecule down to its very smallest in creation, the thing that we are just now being able to figure out and see, he knows how to manipulate those molecules. You ever wondered how the bush was burning and was not consumed? God has the ability to create a barrier around the bush and then light it on fire because he's God. He created everything. He knows every piece of strand in your head, hair and all that, and the sand, all in the earth. He knows all of that. So why couldn't he turn water into wine? Right? And so he's telling us there's something new. A new table is being set. There's going to be a new system, a new sacrificial system to set the stage, to intro Jesus, to fulfill the promises of God. Not to get rid of them, but to fulfill them. And then when John the Baptist pointed to Jesus, different John the Baptist, and there's John the Apostle. Different guys. I know that gets confusing sometimes. When John the Baptist pointed to Jesus and said, behold, the guy I've been talking about is right there. Everybody look, it's him. And everybody turned and they're like, why isn't he glowing? Why isn't he floating? Right? That's probably what they thought. What came before was only a shadow of the good things to come. This was more than a miracle, guys. It was a sign. And that is what John is trying to tell us. It pointed to something and to somebody. But nobody would fully understand until later. And what had come before was necessary for what would follow. And what would follow would surpass what came. And just like most would say, that wine is better than water. So what Jesus was coming to offer was better than what was before. Didn't negate it, it's just better. And so in John 2:11, we move on. It says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Why? Because he told them to just have faith. No, that's not what happened. There was a reason to believe, and he showcased it. In John 2:12, it says, after this went down in Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, there they stayed for a few days, and so the ministry began. Unlike John, our faith does not come by seeing. And that's hard for us, and I get that. Some people did see something. Our faith comes by hearing, by believing in the first-person accounts of the people that were on the scene. And I know what you're thinking. Well, why couldn't Jesus do that for me? It's a blessing and a curse. Because if you had to live in the time, and I don't know why the timing happened and why Jesus came in the time in history he did. Why couldn't he come now with all the cameras and everything? Everybody would believe, right? We would have photographed evidence of it. But for whatever reason, he knew this was the best time to do it. And the people that saw it When you are so close to something powerful like an explosion or rocket, you see it go off, if you're too close, you're going to get burnt. They got burnt. You don't have to get burnt. So they're telling their story being so close to the flames, and they survived. Like, let me tell you how this happened. Let me tell you just how crazy it was and why I risked everything by believing in it. We're not asked just to believe. We're not required to just take it by faith. We're invited to believe what happened based on a testimony, some first-person accounts like John. And John came away from his experience convinced that Jesus is exactly who he said he was. So convinced that, John 1:14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one, the only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John is saying, I was just a fisherman, but I thought it was important enough that you need to hear my experience, that I didn't have, it was bad for me to abandon. I'm sure people suffered, but it was so important to know and see what was going to happen that he followed. Why would he abandon his career, his job, all that to follow this random guy? But he needed you to hear his experience with the rabbi from Nazareth. Not just so that you would know what would happen. It's much bigger than that. Again, John 20:31. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Before this collection is over, as we move from sign to sign, my hope is that you would believe and have life in his name. That you would hear this and you would give it a shot. Not just by faith, but because what we took from John in his first-person account. First person on the scene account of what Jesus did. And you might not have ever been offered this. And I understand why. Because I necessarily wasn't offered this. Because this is hard and this is dirty. It's messy. It makes you flush out the innermost sinful things in your life. And you have to begin to give yourself over to something going, I'm not the center of my universe, somebody else is. I'm not the main character of my story, somebody else is. I'm not to say that I'm not a featured actor in my life, but there is one that came who did something much bigger than I will ever understand. And John's trying to tell us, this is why you should believe. And so I hope that it clarifies things for you. That's not just by faith that you believe, but that you took it from John. Because if you are struggling with your faith, this is where the answer is. This is where the answer has been for 2,000 years. And unfortunately in humanity, we're prideful and we like attention, and sometimes we can get distracted by the wrong things. This is what matters, and this is why we believe. I want you to build your faith on the way that Jesus intended. Not an unknown one, but one that has been known for over 2,000 years. So, don't miss a Sunday. Go on this journey with us, and you get to see Jesus through the eyes of John. And it hopefully will affect you to believe just like John did. Let's pray. Jesus, this is so impactful. This is so huge for us. And over the past thousands of years, we have been dissecting and we have been reviewing and looking at, and humanity's devised religions and denominations based on this text, and dividing ourselves when all of this was meant to unite and bring us back to our Creator. So right now, Lord, as we go through this, as we go through John's account over these next 7 weeks, I pray that you give us clarity of mind, that you open our minds up, that you help us to have the courage to question some things in our life, maybe some other things that we have heard that is conflicting, Lord. That to give us the most accurate possible depiction of you in John's life and then in our lives. Help us to see the things we hadn't seen before so that we can believe, and that gives us hope to have faith of what's to come. Lord, bless this collection, bless Village Heights as we go. In Jesus' powerful name I pray. Amen.